Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we're back on track with the story of Joseph. Last week we took a little sidetrack and talked about Judah and Tamar and all that interesting stuff. This week we are back with Joseph and we're going to see Joseph and Potiphar's wife is the first part. And we're going to see how Joseph's life continues to seemingly spiral out of control every time that it looks like, at least from the human perspective, that God is doing something with him. It seems like every time he rises up, his head gets chopped off and he has to start back down at the bottom and work his way back up. But we're going to see that God is doing something extraordinary in his life, and he's preparing him and teaching him lessons and getting him to be in the right place at the right time for the right reason, and we're going to see that. So I want to begin in verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes, and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian, because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So here we have two stories, the first one much longer than the second, but we have two accounts here of how God is blessing everything that Joseph touches and everything that Joseph does because he has a godly heart, a heart that is seeking to honor God and to be obedient to him, even though he's in a foreign land and he could easily have given up everything that he had been taught as a child, and he could have just tried to blend in with the Egyptians. It would have been much, much easier for him, but he chose to do the hard thing, and God rewarded him greatly for it, though we see in here there are consequences at the same time. When we choose to do the godly thing, people will hate us, people will rise against us, they'll say false things about us, and we can end up in some problems. But, like we see in the end of this chapter, God is still working, and he is not done with Joseph yet. So in the beginning of this, we see that we have the reminder of Joseph was sold, and he was taken down to Egypt, and he was sold to Potiphar. We had that briefly explained to us in chapter 37 before we took a sidetrack. But here we get a refresh on that, and we see that immediately it says, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master." In verse 6, we see that Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, and with Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So this Egyptian man, this captain of Pharaoh's guard, who would be a very prestigious position, he gets this servant, and Joseph, we don't know exactly how long it took here, but he rose through the ranks of the servants and became the head of the household under Potiphar. Think about that for a minute. That is a crazy thing. Someone who was put in a lowly position, who did the right things, was honorable, was godly, was different than those around him, and he rose quickly through the ranks, and he becomes the head of the household and becomes way more than just an ordinary slave or servant. He becomes someone extremely important in a very important household. So it's amazing to see how God is using him here. He was brought to Egypt. He's away from his family, away from his home, away from everything he's known, and yet he's still choosing to do the right things and to live honorably and to live and serve with excellence. Even though he is in a servant role, even though he does not have his own freedom here in this section, we see that even though he's in a position we wouldn't want to be in, he uses that position to honor God and to do the best he can in whatever situation God has. And that's the same thing that each and every one of us as Christians should be trying to do in our day-to-day lives. We should be using whatever position God has placed us in, whether it be something we like or something we hate. We have to use those positions that we're in to serve the Lord to the best of our ability in that position. And that will look very different for people in different positions. But whatever position we are in, we need to use every bit of the intelligence God's given us, of the abilities that he's given us, of all the things that he's blessed us with. We need to use all of that to honor him and to do our best so that other people will look at us and say there's something different about us, and they'll recognize that, and hopefully it will point them to Jesus. Hopefully we can do that not just through our actions but through our words and tell people about Jesus. But we see here that Potiphar recognized there was something different about Joseph, so he puts him in charge of everything. That seems all well and great until we see that there is another character introduced, Potiphar's wife, and she is not a top 10 woman. She sees Joseph, and she realizes that he's a very handsome man. That's fine, but what happens is she goes a step further than just noticing he's a handsome fellow. She decides that she needs to go to bed with him, and she tries day after day, it says. Every day she was trying to get him to do this, but his response is significant. "No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" We see that he, once again, is pointing to the Lord. He is not willing to compromise on his beliefs, even though this is an opportunity that so many people would take advantage of. They would say, well, what's wrong about doing this? I'm in a foreign country. I'm not with my family. I'm just a slave, a servant. I don't really have any rights of my own. I have no freedom, probably no real good life coming ahead of me. I guess I'll just take advantage of this opportunity and just, compromise my beliefs and sin. And we see so much of that in the world today, and it's something that each of us do on a day-to-day basis. We see an opportunity and we take advantage of it, even though we know it goes against our moral beliefs and our Christian beliefs and the things found in Scripture, and we compromise. But we should be following and molding our own lives after Joseph's here, where he is not willing to compromise his beliefs. His reputation and his belief in God and his commitment to God's law is way more important to him than taking advantage of a sinful temptation that may have been appealing at this moment. So we see that he does the right thing, but we know from our own experiences, and we know from experiences throughout the book of Genesis so far, that doing the right thing does not necessarily mean everything's going to go well. In fact, we know that it often leads to problems. And we see that here. He does the right thing day after day, resisting that temptation, something we need to do each day, resist that temptation. And we see that Potiphar's wife decides to play an opposite game. She becomes frustrated with him, and when he comes and there's no other servants around, she gets this opportunity where no one's there. She grabs his cloak and tries once again to get him to give in to the temptation, but he refuses and runs away from the temptation, leaving behind his cloak. Again, this is a powerful illustration for us as Christians to mold our own lives after. When there is a temptation and it just keeps coming day after day after day after day, it tends to get stronger over time, and the voices that try to get us to give in to sin, maybe it's peer pressure, maybe it's one of our friends, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's just thoughts in our head. Whatever it is, the voices that are trying to get us to give in to sin and erode our steadfastness over time, they tend to get louder, and we see that here with Potiphar's wife. She tries and tries and tries, and she's going to try now dragging him, and he decides, rather than to just even say no and go about his business, he decides to leave her presence completely and run out the door, completely resisting temptation and shutting that door once and for all. And we, as Christians, should do the same thing. When we see a temptation coming after day after day after day, we need to sometimes just turn away from that completely, cut something out of our life, whatever it is. We need to make sure that we are not in a position that is going to be tempting for us to be compromising our beliefs. We need to stay pure as Christians and follow after Jesus Christ. And often it means we have to leave something behind so that we can more attentively focus on Jesus Christ without the distractions of our daily temptations. This is great for him in the moment, but unfortunately, Potiphar's wife immediately turns around and comes up with a brilliant idea that she is going to play the part of the victim, which never happens today, but she decides she's going to play the part of the victim and make up this great story about Joseph and how he was the one who wanted her to go to bed with him, and she completely switches roles with him, which, of course, she then shares with her servants and shares with her husband, and it leads to it's a great end of the story. Joseph gets thrown into prison because his master obviously has to take his wife's word over a servant, because that would just be how it would be. And that custom, we don't know if his wife had a reputation of having problems like this. We don't know if he even believed his wife. All we know is that he burned with anger when he heard his wife's story and then threw Joseph into prison. The important part in this story is that we get to see how people are going to treat us when we are Christians. When we make a stand, when we do the right thing, we often have this idea that everyone's going to come and clap for us and just encourage us and say that we're doing all these great things and everything's going to be great. God's just going to deliver us out of all problems. And while it's true that God is going to deliver us, and while God will be with us the whole time, he's not going to leave us. He didn't leave Joseph. There are moments where God allows things to happen that we don't like, that we think shouldn't happen, and this would be one of them. You would think Joseph would be rewarded for his successful resistance of temptation, but instead he is thrown into prison and he has to work over again and rise through the ranks once again, only to, as we'll see later, be left and forgotten again and to have to wait even longer. But we see here, there is something that we can learn. We will face persecution. We will face things in life. When we make stands, when we say, I'm not going to compromise my beliefs, I'm going to stand firmly on the Lord's side, and I'm not going to sin against God, then people are going to rise against us and they're going to attack us. They'll attack our reputation. They'll spread false rumors about us. They'll do things like Potiphar's wife here, where it's a direct lie and the direct opposite of the truth. The entire story, she pretended to be a victim, and we see the same thing in our world today. People pretending to be victims who aren't victims. People claiming that Christians are these horrible people when Christians are trying to help people. So we'll see a lot of that in our own life. But what do we see here? We see that Joseph didn't give up when he was thrown into prison. Instead, the Lord was with him. As a reminder, we get that verse. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So we see that no matter what comes against us in life, God is still able to bring about something good. God is still with us. He hasn't left us, even when it may appear dark and discouraging, and it may be very frustrating for us. Joseph didn't give up on that. Instead, he worked with such favor of the Lord and with such a diligence in his work that the warden put him in charge of all the prison. So think of that. A prisoner is thrown into prison, and he, instead of complaining, instead of resigning to just live a solitary life, he decides that he is going to live with excellence, and all of a sudden he becomes the second in command of a prison. The prisoner becomes pretty much the warden, right underneath the warden. It's an incredible thing, and it shows us that as Christians, we have the opportunity, no matter where we are, no matter what circumstances and situations we find ourselves in, we have the opportunities to work with diligence to shine the light of Christ. And then that light is very attractive for some people, and it makes us rise to the top, and it makes us, it opens up opportunities for us to shine the light even more, even when other people are going to see that same light and try to snuff it out and try to take something for themselves, like we saw with Potiphar's wife. We see that once again, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. This is the same verse that I would want to be applied to my own life. I would want to be in a place, I hope each day that I'm growing more and more like that, where the Lord can clearly be seen in my life, and that the Lord is blessing me, and people see that and recognize that and then respond to that. So I would like to challenge that for the challenge this week to you. Try to live in such a way that you are acting with diligence in everything, in every situation the Lord has placed you in, so that other people will see what you're doing, and they will look to the Lord, and they will see Jesus living through you. Well, I hope that you've been encouraged and challenged by this week, and that you will join me next week as we look at the story of the cupbearer and the baker in Genesis chapter 40.